Hello. My name is Birk. I'm a PhD student at the University of Tromsø. Or was. I'm supposed to submit my thesis sometime next week, so almost done. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of what I've been doing these 3 past years, particularly as it pertains to benchmarking. And that is basically the limits of benchmarking in the concept of distributional shift, and why benchmark scores don't necessarily generalize to real-world conditions. So, if there's anything I want you to take away from this little talk, it's that benchmarks do not actually account for the overall level of variability that exists in the real world. And therefore, benchmark scores and all the claims that we make based on benchmark scores, they are more indicative rather than descriptive. And what I mean by that is that, yes, having good benchmark scores indicates that you have a high-quality system, but that doesn't mean that it will be a high-quality system beyond the immediate nature of the data for which the benchmark describes. So yes, you might get good benchmark scores on, let's say, a medical benchmark, but that does not mean it will actually add quality for clinicians. So this all raises about some serious concerns about the veracity of empirical claims and engineering claims. And so this is something I think everyone who's working with AI and wants to jump on this AI train actually needs to know. So I'll structure the remainder of the talk as follows. I'll first go into some recent AI news, just to put it into context, the sort of claims we're making nowadays to the general public. Then I'll talk a little bit about generalization in AI systems, and then about the notion of externally valid benchmarks, meaning benchmarks that you can actually trust. Then I'll talk a little bit about the way forward, and that's, of course, a little bit of speculation in the end, but see what the future holds. So, like I said, we'll start with some news, see how all the laymen view AI nowadays. And as you all probably are fully aware of, AI is quite hyped nowadays. Everyone is super confident, the results are always promising, super groundbreaking, and the AI revolution is still just around the corner, as it has been for the last 10 years. So, for example, Sam Altman says that AI can now rival someone with a PhD. I don't know if that says something about his opinion of PhD students, but we'll see. Elon Musk ones up this claim by saying that his new AI model is better than PhD students in everything. Quite strong claims about how good AI systems really are. And Microsoft also says that already their AI systems are better than doctors at diagnosing complex health conditions. So again, all this is very, very strong claims. And does it really hold true? Well, they probably base this on something. They're probably not trying to mislead or lie, but they're basing it on benchmarks. And as we'll be talking about quite a lot in this talk, benchmarks are not necessarily indicative of these sorts of claims. Rather, they are just some general pointer as to the quality of a system at a more basic level. So you might all say, OK, but this is large companies. It's Sam Altman, Elon Musk. They're bound to overstate the benefits of the systems that they're making, right? And that's true. There's probably a little bit of marketing involved there, but there's also a lot of hype in the research. So, for example, in this little paper I found in the abstract a claim that this code generation LLMs outperform 85% of human participants. In another paper, that is HealthBench, which Michael mentioned in his talk, they stated that even after developing this super complicated, super difficult benchmarks, LLMs still outperform doctors. And I think that's a pretty red flag. It's pretty suspect when you try to develop a difficult benchmarks, and still your model that you make money off of is outperforming doctors. So again, the research is not immune here. So in general, just beyond these papers, there's often very strong claims in AI research. Something along the lines of, oh, our methods are better than the baseline, therefore they have applicability in the real world. Or things like, our methods score better on benchmarks, and therefore they're better than other methods. And both these claims are a little bit suspect. So let's look into this then, that high benchmark scores are indeed indicative of overall quality. So again, let's have a look at some news. Let's see the many successes of AIs recently, or lack thereof, really. So recently, there was an article in NRK, and this is based on a research paper, of course, detailing how when they started trying to use AI systems in medical contexts, they showed that endoscopy screenings for cancer in the colon, there was a reduction in 25% of detection rates. Or sorry, 21%. And that's a quite big reduction, and that's just compared to how doctors normally operate. And of course, there can be a lot of different factors affecting this, like automation, compliance, and stuff like that. But nevertheless, obviously, despite all these really good benchmark scores, it's not really working that well in practice. There's another example. It's a few months ago now, but a man in, I think he was in Tromsø, he asked ChatGPT to describe himself, as I think almost everyone has done this point. And what ChatGPT responded was, okay, this and this person, he has 3 children, he lives in this and this area, and that's all correct. And then it also hallucinated, and he killed his children. And that's, of course, libel. So obviously, despite the mountains of LLM research that we've been doing, and not to mention the mountains of research on LLM guardrailing, we still have these, frankly, dangerous hallucinations happening when people are actually using these systems. And if you want to be able to trust outputs, then, of course, that's not a very good idea. And finally, another little news story. So there's a company called Builder AI, which marketed itself as this AI development platform. And as it turns out, it wasn't an AI development platform. It was a team of 700 engineers in India. And this is despite these previous claims that, oh yeah, we can outperform 85% of humans. And yeah, maybe these 700 Indian engineers are really, really good and outperform the LLMs too. Or more likely, the LLMs aren't as good as we really think they are. And of course, these news stories are just what is particularly noteworthy. So this problem with benchmark scores not really being indicative of real-world performance has been known for quite a long time, in particular in more older literature, let's say, in AI. So this old paper, I think it's from 2017 or something, shows that a lot of AI models learn very good predictive patterns on a given benchmark, but these often fail as soon as you move out of the benchmark context. And I won't go into detail at each paper here, but they're all worth reading. But there's another paper here where they show that code generation models just completely fail if there's some slight bug in the code that they're intended to analyze. The reversal curves, which means that the LLMs often struggle to sentence reversal. And of course, that these code generation methods that we've been looking into, they don't really work as well as the benchmarkers would have you believe. So overall, these claims are hopefully not intentionally wrong, and still they're not really correct either. So there's something must be going wrong here. And essentially, what this can be attributed to, according to some analyses anyway, is the notion of externally invalid benchmarks and distributional shift. So to understand these terms a little bit more, some slight preliminaries are necessary. So in the modern approaches to AI, data is viewed as samples drawn from a distribution. Now, of course, this is very abstract and high-dimensional and so on, but you can look at it in a pretty simple way. So let's say you have a distribution of cats. And of course, you can train LLM or any sort of model to try to model this distribution. So for example, for any sort of analysis where it's LLMs or image classification and so on. And if you benchmark it on just this distribution, you might discover that, oh yeah, it performs really well. However, what happens when there's a new distribution? So let's say we move from normal-looking cats to hairless cats. We haven't tested on that, we haven't trained on that, so we don't really know how well it will perform. And this is, very simply put, essentially what is happening with these code generation errors and all that sort of stuff. Essentially, we're training on a very limited amount of data that doesn't really represent the real world, and we're also testing and benchmarking on very limited data so that we can draw conclusions. And these conclusions are, of course, only indicative of the source distribution rather than the overall distribution as a whole. So just for some terminology here, this is referred to as a distributional shift when there's a change in the data that manifests it this way. It is also referred to as out of distribution or in distribution, just so we're clear on the terminology. So this is a very well-known problem in most AI research that we seem to have forgotten about now and again, and we forget about it intermittently every time we have a new breakthrough, it seems. But basically, it is caused by what is known as IID violations, which means that, okay, we're just not collecting enough diverse data. So and basically, from a purely mathematical perspective, deep neural networks cannot reliably generalize beyond the immediate nature of the data on which they're trained. And the same applies for benchmarks. Benchmark scores cannot really generalize beyond the precise nature of the data the benchmark represents. So if, for example, benchmark doesn't account for different backgrounds, different textures, different pose, distortions, adversarial examples, whatever, then they're not likely to be representative of the real world. So yeah, let's go back to benchmarks again. So yeah, generalization failure is caused by these IID violations, as established. But an ideal benchmark ideally should be able to uncover these sorts of failures, and yet they don't. And why is that? Well, that's because making an ideal benchmark requires collecting data for the test sets that is just as representative of the real world as the real world. So it's just as difficult to make good benchmarks as it is to make fully representative data sets. So to say, it's probably not going to be make really representative benchmarks anytime soon. And now we come to this concept of external validity. And this is another term which basically describes the degree to which a benchmark reveals real-world quality. And often, benchmarks lack external validity. So in this paper, for example, they tried to introduce a new medical benchmark. And through their analyses, they basically showed that their new benchmark exposed that 53 existing medical benchmarks failed to expose errors in outputs that were very critical to the quality of the system. In another paper, it was shown that LMs were really sensitive to paraphrasing questions in like a question and answering benchmark, and that if you sort of paraphrase the questions, then the performance would just plummet. So obviously, you can't trust users to know the exact phrasing of the questions in a real-world setting. So this is really just evidence that the model isn't working the way we want to. And finally, it's not just LLMs, of course. This has been known with ImageNet classifiers for a long time. So despite the sheer size of ImageNet, for example, we frequently see that new data collected using ImageNet techniques is also associated with accuracy drops of like 14%, which is quite significant. And that's the same type of data as the training data. So essentially, we're just overfitting to the benchmarks as well. So the question then is, can we design externally valid benchmarks and thus have some sort of indication of whether the systems we're designing actually work in practice? Well, yes and no. And it depends on what we're trying to use the benchmark scores for. If we want a relative ranking of algorithms or networks or interventions, anything like that, say you want to say that, oh, ChatGPT outperforms Claude or whatever, then the evidence shows that that might be possible. So with this little paper, which is part of John Miller's PhD, really good work, so I recommend reading that, he showed that essentially the in-distribution accuracy and out-of-distribution accuracy is very strongly correlated. And what that means is that if you have very high scores in the benchmark, that means that it's likely that the model will be better than another model which has low benchmark scores. It does not mean that there will be good generalization, meaning that there might be a large drop from the benchmark to the real world, but the order is preserved. So you can still make relatively sound empirical claims about whether one model is better than another. On the other hand, there's also been some work really raising questions about this sort of relative ranking preservation. And they have shown in this paper here that, yeah, if you consider ImageNet results, then one algorithm doesn't generally perform better than any other in the real world, although you often observe fairly large differences on the ImageNet datasets. So relatively, maybe. We're not sure. But for ranking or for as evidence of real-world quality, probably not. We can't really design really good, externally valid benchmarks to this end without lots and lots of resources, at least. So this leads to a more general conclusion is that benchmarks may be good for guiding research. And of course, we've seen that from the fact that our research is actually doing quite well. But they're bad at expressing real-world quality. So that means you cannot assume that having good benchmarks scores indicates that you're actually making a good quality system. So what now? Well, first of all, as scientists, we have to start tempering the claims we make. We can't assume that our scores will generalize beyond the immediate nature of the dataset. And we have to make the scope and limitations of the benchmarks we make very explicit. And like I said at the beginning of this talk, we have to treat benchmark scores as indicative rather than descriptive. And finally, we have to try to maximize external validity in our benchmarks, even though that might be costly. And like it's been mentioned several times during today, it's a little bit of boring work. So we can also try to characterize the limitations of claims a little bit more rigorously. So for example, we can try to package benchmarks with stress testing functionality. So try to lean into this sort of infinite benchmarking idea or interactive benchmarks that's been mentioned earlier today. We can, for example, add adversarial perturbations or adversarial prompting to benchmarks, which is in a non-deterministic manner, meaning that it's not just a static benchmark, but we can actually try to explore the limits of your model on the benchmark. You can also try curating explicitly difficult benchmarks. So for example, there's a variant of ImageNet called ImageNet Hard, which still has, like, at best case, 20% accuracy or something like that. And that's also generally a good approach as long as there's no data contamination. You can also have multiple independent testing data sets with distinct provenance. And that means that you collect multiple data sets from different places and try to keep them fairly different. And then that should be a greater indication of how well the model will eventually generalize. And of course, we have that notion of infinite benchmarks, which has been discussed earlier today. Let's see. And there's also one more, a little bit more speculative method, which has been the subject of a lot of my PhD work. And that is, it might be possible to characterize what is referred to as the operational envelope of a given model. And what I mean by that is that we can distinguish between input data for which a given model can correctly predict and data for which it cannot. And this will, of course, always be approximate, so it's not a perfect solution by any means. But we can basically model the distributions of the data, so the in-distribution data versus the input data. And then we can try to ascertain whether a given input is in the distribution or out of distribution. And this can be achieved with already existing algorithms called out-of-distribution detectors, so that you can more or less ensure at runtime, as in the real world, whether or not the model is predicting correctly. This is a little bit more of like a band-aid solution, though. So we will still struggle to have good, solid expressions of quality beforehand. But at least this way we'll avoid some of the more catastrophic and ethical failures that may arise as a result of misleading benchmarks. So yeah. Oops. So in summary, benchmarks are often effective for guiding research. Obviously, we wouldn't have had as much progress otherwise. And they may preserve the relative ranking between different interventions, or they may not. There doesn't seem to be a very strong conclusion one way or another in the literature. However, it is very worth emphasizing that having good benchmark scores does not necessarily provide a valid representation of real-world quality. So keep that in mind when someone is trying to sell you an AI system or anything like that. So claiming otherwise, just like our friend Sam Altman and Elon Musk did, I would say that that's straight up misleading. You can't say that, oh yeah, our models are straight up better than PhD students, because on what basis are you saying that? On a limited benchmark which doesn't represent the real world? Well, then that claim isn't really very strong or on strong ground. So we have to temper our scientific claims accordingly. We can't be overconfident in the quality of our systems, even though they may be really cool and all that. And when you're designing benchmarks, you should strive for external validity. And in the future, maybe, who knows, maybe it will turn out that we can improve benchmarks with greater external validity or implicitly define regions for which benchmarks apply. Yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email at any time or have a chat in one of the breaks. And yeah, thanks.